brain on this. So when you were going through it, what stood out to you? What is it? Does it look like a better roster potentially than what we saw last year that went 10-2? What do you make of the 2025 depth chart at this point?
No, it's not a better team. It's not a
Hmm.
better roster. I mean, this is somewhere between this could be either be rebuilding or reloading.
Hmm.
And this may seem like similar terms, but rebuilding is so Josh Heupel, I think, has a pretty high floor. At this
Hmm.
point in his tenure, I think his floor is 8-4 record. So rebuilding is 8-4. And
Hmm.
the roster they have now, I think, is probably around 8-4. The roster they could have would be the ceiling, which would be around 10-2. But they've got some work to get there. They've got to add some guys from the portal. They have to develop some guys that have questions about. But just, I mean, if you just look at a few positions, wide receiver is not good enough right now. Could be later, but I think there's way too many questions at wide receiver that has to be improved in the portal and elsewhere. Offensive line could be fixed in the portal pretty quickly. I have a little more hope on that one. Um, because I do think Josh Heupel's offensive lines in that scheme, they tend to play pretty well regardless of who you plug in there. They're just going to be plugging a lot of different new faces there. I have a little more hope for the offensive line. A defensive line, I'm good with. I get a lot of questions from fans of like, how are they going to rebuild the defensive line? They lost 3 tackles that'll all be in the NFL next year. They lost James Pierce, who probably be a first round pick. They lost Jason Jenkins to the portal. I'm kind of fine with the defensive line. I mean, they played usually 12 guys, and I think 7 of them are coming back.
Hmm.
Like any other team, if they said you're getting 7 guys back on the defensive line that played, all those guys played more than 100 snaps, most of them more than 250 snaps. Like most teams would look at that and say, "Oh, okay, so all the starters are back."
Hmm.
Like no, 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 no. But 7 of the top 12. It just happened to be that Tennessee had probably the deepest defensive line in college football last year. And so that's a luxury. And I just sort of trust Rodney Garner to bring 2 or 3 guys along. I think there's a logjam of talent at defensive line. And so I'm not worried about that at all. Jermod McCoy's ACL injury bothers me, worries me, because I think that becomes now a portal need at corner. Um, so you've got to answer a lot of those questions. Offensive line's got to be shorn up. Wide receiver, you've got to find some type of difference maker, and you got to make it work at corner until Jermod gets back. If you answer those questions in the affirmative, then this could be a 10-2 team. But right now, I'm more in the 8 to 9 win range.
Do you think that's where they're at internally? Do they see this more as a rebuild, or do you think that they see it more as a retool?
Um, I would hope they see some of the problems more as schematic.
Hmm.
Like I mean, Josh Heupel, he hands over the defense to Tim Banks and Rodney Garner and all his assistants and say, "Hey, you guys were really good this year. See if you can be really good next year with a different lineup."
Hmm.
But his whole focus is on offense. He's an offensive guy, and I would say if Tennessee's offense gets back to where it was, closer to where it was 2 years ago, it's going to be as much of changes on scheme as it is personnel. Like they just didn't have guys open in the
Hmm.
passing game against good teams this year. Some of that is guys weren't getting separation. There's no Cedric Tillman on this bunch that you can throw up the ball and he'll beat a guy for a high ball. There's not a Jalen Hyatt on this roster yet. Now, Mike Matthews could develop into that or somebody else. It took Jalen a couple years till he hit that. But the difference with those guys a couple years ago is they were schemed open. Like Josh Heupel and Golish and even some Halsley, they schemed them open.
Hmm.
And Hendon Hooker hit them when they were open. And those pieces all fit together in a good way. And some of the wideouts struggled this year. Nico struggled at times this year. The protection struggled this year. Like everything took a half step back, but the scheme took bigger step back than that. I think that's where the most improvements got to be. Josh Heupel needs to be recruiting and getting guys out of the portal, but they've got to sit in the film room and figure out how it is they can counter what's going on because their opponents have now countered that offense. They put a lot of safeties over top. They keep everything in front of them. And they just have not. I mean, the counter to that is you throw short underneath. You run the ball well, which they did with Dylan Sampson, and you throw underneath, and you have guys that can be dynamic in the open field. And they didn't have those guys. I mean, I love Squirrel White, but if you throw him a 7-yard pass, he's going to get 9 yards. He's not going to break it for 40. And of course, Squirrel's gone now, but they have to either develop those guys or find those guys, but they have to scheme them open in different ways.
That's fair. I look at it in terms of like the defense. I think we're on the same page when it comes to defense. I mean, this is a borderline top 10 defense this year. I think people probably overthought the Ohio State blowout. You saw what Oregon dealt with right after, and they're now the national champs. And the Georgia stuff was surprising, I think, with just the fact they weren't able to get home once on 40 dropbacks for Carson Beck. I thought that was weird. But to your point, I think they're going to be fine. Like Jordan Ross, Caleb Herring, and company are going to step right in for James Pierce. Joshua Joseph's going to have a really good year. Like they're going to be just fine on the defensive line. I think Marion Dye is going to be a good player. Isaiah Campbell was a big late ad. Like the strong side defensive inside, like losing Jason Jenkins, but like Garner develops there. Like the whole defensive side of the ball, there is a proof of concept where they've gotten better in scoring defense every year. You retain Tim Banks, which I think is a win because I think he is somewhere in that top 10 to 15 in the nation defensive coordinator. I'm not saying he's the best, but I do think he is somewhere in the top 15 and he gets better every year. The Jerron McCoy injury, you talk about hurts, but like let's see where Caleb Beasley is in the spring. Like he's a blue chipper that you kept around. I wonder Jordan Matthews, if he had known like what was happening here, like is he back? Because he was kind of that next man up after Jalen McMurray. So I don't know what that would have been like, but it's complicated. The portal's complicated. But I think they're going to be better at star. Boo Carter, another year in the system, he's going to be a lot more comfortable. I think they're going to be better with Idris Farouk potentially at that Will Brooks spot because that's where they got picked on was in those big games against Arkansas, against Georgia, and against Ohio State. It was the middle of the field, and it was safety. Like Will Brooks was solid in spots, but if you weren't getting home, the middle of the field was open. Like the wheel routes out of the backfield, targeting tight ends right there in the seams. That's where they were hitting people. And not having Keenan Pili the last 2 years really hurt because I think he was a difference maker for them in the middle of the field and was just kind of that leader on the defensive linebackers. But you have Aaron Carter in year 3. I think Edwin Spillman is going to be a really good player if he can stay healthy. But you're only going to play blue chippers at linebacker now at this point. I think defense is going to be fine. I think there's a case to be made that the defense is better in 25 than it was in 24.
I don't know if the defense overall will be better. I mean, statistically, this was the best. Like, this is the best scoring defense they've had since the national title year.
Yeah.
That's all you can ask for. And I do get the frustrations by fans over the Georgia and Ohio State games. But, like, think about what you're saying. They were great in, like, 11 games or 10 games, whatever, and they were not great in 2. Like, you can live with that. Like, get to the tournament, get to the playoff, and then try to figure those things out. There are tweaks that Tim Banks needs to make. I think particularly how much he blitzes, when he blitzes. They've got to find an answer at linebacker of guys that can drop into coverage more, like you mentioned. There's fixes to that. What I like on defense is it seems to be more of a sense that they will try different guys out to find a solution. Rodney Garner has always done that. I mean, he plays a lot of guys, but William Inge at linebackers, like he's fine plugging in a freshman and like, let's see if this guy can do it in this situation. And you saw a little more of that in the secondary this year too. So defense will be